after, so I will go ahead and get us started. So welcome, colleagues. Let me start by saying thank you so much to everyone who is joining us today for the kickoff of our very first panel for the Research with International Students conference panel session, where we have 10 different panels happening between now and June, which are all centered around the theme of navigating polycrisis in research with international students. Our intention with these panels is to hopefully encourage some wider conversations that expand the focus of our field and connect student mobilities with a range of important and pressing problems that we're seeing within our wider world today. If you haven't seen the rest of our lineup over the next couple of months, I'll add that to the chat in a moment, and really do encourage colleagues to consider signing up for some other panels of interest, because although I'm personally very biased, we have a really great lineup of topics and speakers to come over the coming months. If this is your very first RIS event, then a very special welcome to you. If you don't know what our network is, we're a scholarly community of people who include international students in our research as participants or co-researchers, and generally we're very interested in developing more critical and ethical research related to international student mobility. If you haven't met me before, my name is Jenna Mittelmeier. I'm one of the co-founders and the lead organizers for the network, and I've also helped organize today's panel as well. If you'd like to learn more about the network, you can find us online, and I'll put that link in the chat in just a moment as well. But turning our attention to today's panel, we have a really fantastic lineup of speakers who are all going to be talking about the topic of materialities and material injustices in international student mobility. Three of them are joining us live today. We've got Bruna, Shannon, and Katja, along with Dangeni, whose presentation will be via a video recording due to her travel requirements. So I'll kindly ask each of the speakers to very briefly introduce themselves at the start of their presentations, but all four are going to be speaking about this topic of materialities, which we are defining in this session as considerations for the tangible world of materials and objects and environments, and how these speak to or influence our human experiences. So across these presentations, we'll be encountering together today a sense of the intersections of different material conditions and their social impacts on international students. And we'll also be thinking about how these materialities create environments or conditions that are unequal between different groups of students. How the panel will work today is that each speaker is going to discuss their work for about 15 minutes each. We'll do these one by one, and then we'll move to a joint and collective discussion in the last half hour between the panel members related to your comments and questions. So those of you that are in the audience, we will invite you to make your contributions in the final part of the session for questions or comments about this theme kind of across the presentations. You can contribute as we go along by adding a comment or a question into the chat or the Q&A, but you can also, I believe, I'm very new to Teams, I believe you can also raise your hand to speak out loud at the end of the session as well. If you want to ask your question anonymously, you can also send me a private message via the chat as well. As I said at the start, we are recording the session today, but we will stop that recording when it comes time for the Q&A at the end. So I will now take a step back and hand over to Bruna, who is our first speaker. So over to you, Bruna.
Thank you very much. I will start to share my screen. One moment. Can you see my screen now? Perfect. And can also see me and hear me well? Good. So, hello everyone. I'm Bruna, a researcher at the Polytechnic School of Health from Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, Brazil. And today I will present about my study entitled Bridging Cultures and Overcoming Inequalities, autoethnographic study of a Brazilian PhD student's exchange in Japan, focusing on my academic trajectory as also. So I have two guiding questions that help me to think about that study. The first one is, how do family ties and friendships mediate access to material and symbolic resources that make academic mobility possible? Second, how do cultural and emotional dimensions shape everyday experiences of inclusion and exclusion in scientific practice? First, I would like to briefly explain about one of the experiences that shaped my path toward human and social sciences studies. During my teenage years, reading manga made me question, are we born who we are? Are our abilities and beliefs predetermined? And this picture is from a Japanese comic book that tells a story of a high school student who was diagnosed with a degenerative condition and how she refused to be only defined by that condition, expressing her agency through diary writing. Well, based on that experience, I was motivated to understand more about how do beliefs, norms, social representations can influence human behavior. And that's why I choose social sciences as my first major, and my undergraduate monograph focus on understanding how do expressions of emotion shape classroom interactions and the dynamics of the teaching and learning process. Later, I started my master's in science, and my focus was how do emotions influence the scientific training of youth who were not previously socialized into scientific practice. During my PhD in science, I chose an interdisciplinary approach to understand how can historical, cultural, and emotional aspects integrate scientific activities and meanings attributed to science in their respective context. Also, I could do a comparative study focusing on two science education programs, one from Brazil called Scientific Vocation Program of Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, and the other one, Sakura Science High School Program from Japanese Technology and Science Agency. That's why I also had the opportunity to do a doctoral exchange at University of Tsukuba to learn empowerment theories and enhancing my skills and observation techniques, including participant observation in the Sakura Science Education Program. Regarding autoethnographic approach that I choose to use in this study, it involves the researcher engaging in narrative analysis of their own experiences in close relation to a specific phenomenon. Also, it constitutes a form of critical inquiry that is grounded in both theory and practice, in my case, particularly in the researcher's professional trajectory. Also, it requires the use of archival materials, ongoing self-observation, and reflective recording. Triangulation with multiple data sources is also very important to enhance analytical depth. The study is also grounded in Pierre Bourdieu's concept of social and cultural capital, which helps explain how individuals, resources, and social positions influence their academic paths. Now, regarding my experience with scholarship and crowdfunding to make possible my doctoral exchange in Japan, it's important to contextualize about where I study and work in Brazil. What condition influence also my trajectory, and it's related to social inequalities that in general shape access to and retention in educational spaces. That's why throughout my entire academic trajectory in higher education, I relied on government-funded scholarships, both in Brazil and during my international exchange, which were very important to sustaining my academic path. This Brazilian program aims to foster the internationalization of Brazilian academic and provided core funding for doctoral exchange, for example, in my case, at a Japanese university. Unfortunately, it has not been adjusted since 2013 and did not cover enrollment fees. That's why crowdfunding played a crucial role in covering financial gaps related to my student visa and enrollment fees. It's important to mention that most contributors were people who already knew my academic trajectory. This tendency is consistent with recent research showing that more than 50% of Brazilian donors were mobilized through personal relationship networks. Regarding my family caregiving arrangements, I live with my grandparents and I am their primary caregiver. My mother and aunt, during my time studying abroad, took over their care. It's important to mention that care-related domestic work sustains everyday life and enables engagement in activities outside the home, such as doing academic work. Unfortunately, yet it remains largely undervalued in Brazil because it's not framed as remunerated labor here. I recognize that this labor is part of important work for the collective dimension of academic trajectories. Regarding institutional connections and networks, it's important to mention my experience during 2023 when I worked on the support team of Studying Japan project here in Brazil. Through organizing events and interacting with colleagues, I acquired practical knowledge about housing, city infrastructure, dormitories, local transportation, and Japanese academic customs. I know that this material and symbolic resources acquired through social capital and gradual exposure to everyday institutional practice reduced uncertainty and made the exchange easier to navigate. Regarding my fieldwork during 2024 in Japan, I could do participant observation at an edition from Sakura Science High School program, and it was only possible because I received support from university staff who were also friends. They guided me through the participation procedures and administrative process within the context of Japanese bureaucratic culture. Also, during that time, I had to deal with a lot of bureaucratic challenges. For example, my participation required 4 revisions before approval. Throughout this entire process, my colleagues' guidance and encouragement were fundamental to my persistence and to the preparation of the document in Japanese language. Also, this experience leads me to the idea of thinking with care. From this perspective, scientific work is relational and interdependent. Challenges competitive models of knowledge production, values collaborative practice that recognize diverse trajectories, accepting vulnerability and conflict as part of collaboration. Also, I recognize that social and cultural capital shared by academic advisors and peer networks play an important role in opening opportunities during my academic trajectory. At the same time, emotions such as friendship, understood as an emotion mobilized by the search for sociability, which connects shared interests and mediates material and social status inequalities, influence my decision to engage in academic spaces where these relationships had already been established, including the University of Tsukuba. Regarding my experience with inclusion and everyday practice in Japan as an autistic researcher, I know that implicit social rules were very difficult to navigate, and where institutions provide explicit support, such as clear instructions for rules that are usually assumed, concrete examples of expected behavior in common academic situations, and written step-by-step procedures, inclusion can be improved. Based on my experience with Japanese institutional bureaucracy, everyday practice such as group work are very important for developing a sense of belonging and for gradually becoming accustomed to social expectations. Regarding implications and contributions that I think my study can share, I consider that promote inclusive research environments for autistic people needs to have such kind of conversation, asking autistic team members how they prefer to communicate and create shared routines that promote clarity and predictability, maintain regular meetings and updates with clear agendas and advanced materials to reduce uncertainty, clear defined tasks, responsibilities, and deadlines. Finally, provide structure opportunities such as peer support, short practice sessions, and clear guidance so autistic members can become familiar with group interactions before formal academic activities. This study highlights scientific knowledge as a collective and socially constructed process. Recognize its cultural, historical, and relational dimensions can strengthen public engagement and reinforce social responsibility in research. This is my references. Thank you very much, and I am available to ask any questions.
Great. Thank you so very much, Bruna. That's a great starting point from your personal experience. I'm going to move us just in the interest of time to Shannon next, but colleagues, if you've got questions directly for Bruna for clarification, please do put into the chat and be thinking of your questions for the end of the session. So Shannon, over to you now.
Hi, everyone. Just take a second to share my window. All right, are we able to see and hear okay? Great, thank you. All right, let's get started. So thank you everyone for joining us. And for those of you I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet and the Research with International Students community, my name is Shannon Hutcheson, and I am a researcher based at McGill University, located in Montreal, Canada, or is known by Indigenous peoples as Turtle Island. And I am a former international student, which still informs my research practice and my research lens as I navigate that transition from student to worker on temporary status on the postgraduate requirement. So today I'll be talking about representations of international student conditionality and bureaucratic labor seen through objects, transitional space, and using technology as a counter tool. So before we get into the presentation today, I'd really like to first ground this talk in where my research home is. So some of you may have had a chance to see this ideological seascape created by Jenna and our other colleagues with the Research with International Students community. I'm a visual person, so I find it really helpful to situate my research on the map. And I've spent a lot of time, I guess, like vacationing and working in the critical K in this critical space and critical internationalization. And I really like George Mwangi's definition for how we can understand what this criticality means. And they explain it as critical research, which promotes transforming the status quo, rectifying injustices and inequities, and understanding power to illuminate oppression, exploitation, and marginalization. So in my research, I'm really looking at the ways that international students have been othered and marginalized by international student status. And all of these points on marginalization are bound by intersectionality. So I'll unpack what that looks like in just a moment. But all of that to say, I'm centering international students as an equity-seeking group in the research that I do. And this feeds into the question that's driving what we're discussing today. And what do material injustices look like for international students, including those at transitions as they navigate conditionality, bureaucracy, and the evolving poly crisis? This talk is a little bit more conceptual than what I typically do, but this panel really offered a really unique opportunity to reflect on how I've been really addressing these questions of international student inequity. I do have international students in transitions in parentheses, and that's very intentional. I really want to encourage a broader view of how we understand international students, especially when we talk about conditionality. And this is really inspired by my colleagues Bennett and other contributors to research with international students, because we have those with expired or precarious visa status, students who are studying at sanctuary schools, maybe without status, those with rejected visas or who are awaiting renewals, and international students who are transitioning. So there's a bit of a gray space when people make it from international student to worker, or changing from international student to refugee status. And these broader inclusions become even more important in this evolving poly crisis because in many of our institutions, we're seeing, policies really changing at breakneck speeds, and it's really leaving a lot of students in these gray spaces. A quick walkthrough of what we can expect for the time that we have left today. I'll really start by really just showing, how does conditionality and bureaucracy manifest? But we have to understand what conditionality is. So I'll start by grounding what that is, and then feeding into how these inequities can be seen through material objects. So looking at paperwork as a form as bureaucratic violence. And then we'll go on to looking at these spaces. So what are these borders and spaces that international students occupy? And also what are some of these liminal spaces as students navigate these tricky transitions? And then we end with understanding technology as a counter tool. So how can technology be used to remedy some of these injustices? So years ago, I had the opportunity to interview international students on how they conceptualize inequity. So my research critically analyzed international student inequity through policy and also through student testimonies. And while we got really 9 interesting themes that inform how international students really see inequity, 2 themes are really relevant for this talk today, and that is conditionality and bureaucratic labor. So in this session, we'll talk about how these concepts are not just abstract, but they really tangibly manifest through objects, through spaces, and also technology. And these reflections, again, are informed by the interviews that I had with students. So conditionality of status refers to the contingencies required for students to legally remain in their country of study. And these are continuous, and you need to meet these criteria through bureaucratic labor. So bureaucratic labor is really that corresponding time, waiting, and in some cases, physical effort of obtaining documentation. So we have students who have had to fly to other countries to get the biometrics because the wait times were too long in their home countries. Students who have to, we call it flag pulling, where you have to circle the border and come back into the country to get your documents validated. So all of that feeds into this idea of bureaucratic labor. And at the center of this really thematic mapping of how we understand international student inequity, this diagram on the left, you'll see that intersectionality is really at the heart of it. So how one experiences these different conditionalities, how one experiences these forms of bureaucratic violence are contingent on so many factors. So race, passport status, and passport power, and many other dimensions that I'll start to unpack in just a minute. and a reminder that this conditionality is not static, nor is it absolute. So geopolitics and this evolving polycrisis and these shifting factors that this rapidly evolving policy landscape are absolutely impacting who can stay in what country and under what conditions, right? So in a local example of where I am in Canada, we have Indian students who are systematically being targeted by the Canadian immigration systems as the government seeks to actively reduce student numbers from this country. And a few years ago, we also had mounting geopolitical tensions between Canada and Saudi Arabia, which also left international students from this country really in limbo as this unfolded. So bureaucracy is slow. That's no secret. I think many of us have experienced that in our lives. But it can be slow or slower, depending on what your passport status looks like. And that's heavily mediated by systemic discrimination, depending on what passport you're coming from, and also your country, and heavy bias. So to offer an example, I'm in Canada, but I'm also in Quebec. And if you are from, for example, an African nation, there was an audit that found that 70% of visas, student visas from African nations, were rejected. So that's something that we have to really unpack when we're talking about this conditionality. And just highlighting again, understanding the body as a meeting point and understanding how this body as a meeting point might impact how you're able to navigate the world, navigate borders, and how you experience different forms of bureaucratic violence. So just to offer a couple of quick examples of how conditionality manifested in the interviews that I had with international students. For the sake of time, I'll just offer one example, and we'll start with Sahar, which is in the middle. So Sahar said, I was really stressed, like my identity would be taken away from me. It's also that it'll disrupt my education, it'll disrupt my life. And I didn't know what to do, and I was trying to contact whoever I could talk about it. So Sahar is talking about delays in processing her study work, her study permit. She didn't have answers, and she was just left in this state of waiting. And for context, Sahar is from Afghanistan. She wasn't in a position where she could go home and renew her expiring documents. Because of the research that she does, it was not safe for her to go home and to do that. So she was kind of left in this gray space as she was waiting for either her international student status or switching over from international student to refugee. So we see these really complicated cases where we see these different conditionalities play out. So I see conditionalities as kind of these if and then statements. If I get my paperwork processed, then I can stay here. But there's kind of cascading effects. So for some students who, hadn't been able to leave their country, for example, they're still waiting for their study permit. But the semester is starting. That also leads to material injustices because your flight's going to be more expensive. You're not going to be able to find an apartment like the rest of your colleagues who maybe live in that area or were able to immigrate earlier. So that's a different way we can understand these intersectionalities and conditionalities. But I'd also like to spend some time talking about actual material objects. So material objects can be understood through paperwork, which is really an emblematic form of bureaucratic labor and violence. So the value that's imbued in these documents, so the study permits that we need, the visas that you might need, and also the effort that's required to obtain this physical piece of paper. And passport power, again, adds another layer to this. So some students, cross borders with just their passport and maybe a study permit that's paper clipped or stapled in their passport. But for some students, that burden of proof is significantly higher with the documentation that's required. So that could be bank documents, language test results, accommodation plans, and so much more. So one of my colleagues actually shared this with me. This is just one of the folder dossiers that she has when she goes to, for example, conferences outside of Canada. My colleague has a Chinese passport, and she's between statuses, so former international student, but also doesn't have Canadian citizenship just yet. So it's still required to physically have all of this paperwork to get into some countries that require it. And she was also talking about just the financial cost of printing off all of these documents every time, every time she's leaving the country. So it's really helpful to understand how bureaucracy can be seen through physical paperwork and also how bureaucratic violence can manifest in this. So I just talked quickly about these material objects, but I'd also like to think about spaces and what an image can make us feel about certain spaces. So I know for the sake of time, there's not much, but if you have a moment to contribute, what does this image make you feel? And there's no right or wrong answer. And I'll give people a second to share in the chat if they like. You. Also, I'm realizing I can't quite see the chat while I'm sharing, but thanks.
Shannon, you've got cold, sad, empty. It makes me feel alone. Conference room, empty space.
Thank you, Jenna. Yeah, so
Isolated.
thank you. Thank you for taking the time to share that. So for context, I saw this photo at an exhibit last year, and it felt really familiar as I was looking at it. The room felt kind of forlorn, but it felt familiar, and it reminded me of just sitting in really uncomfortable spaces. So I've lived outside of my home country, which is the US, for about 15 years. And I think I've been on like 6 or 7 different visas in the interim. And so I think of those weird spaces where you're at the airport, for example, where you're not quite in the country, you're kind of in border limbo. And it doesn't matter where you are. I feel like they often look the same. Maybe there's one sad vending machine in the corner, uncomfortable chairs, but these spaces of waiting and these spaces of uncertainty. And I know we're running low on time, but I just want to offer a quick anecdote. When I lived in France as a worker, you didn't have access to an appointment system. So you had to show up at the prefecture to get your visa validated. So the first time I went, I made the mistake. I came a few hours early and it was too late to be seen. So the next time I came, and I was prepared because my feet hurt from standing last time. So I actually had a folding stool from IKEA. So I sat on my stool. I think I got there at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then at 8 a.m., you might have the privilege of being seen. So when I saw that chair, I was just thinking of the objects in them and also just those weird spaces of uncertainty and not knowing if you'll get the documentation that you'd like to have. But I just like to quickly say that technology is also a counter tool to some of these injustices. And I want to stress that for international students, things don't just happen to international students, they're also active agents. And they have mobilized against some of these injustices by building communities online. So when I interviewed international students, I heard all of these anecdotes about, survival of, where do I find information? If I'm from this country, how long is the wait time? Just these like informal support networks on WeChat, WhatsApp, Facebook groups. And also just the humor that we use to get through some of these situations. So one participant said that she had a group for Brazilian students where they shared resources, and it was called Those Who Suffered and Now Celebrate It. So I use this anecdote a lot, but it's still really powerful of, we have to use humor to get through those moments. I won't have a chance to show more about the supports online, but for just quickly saying what's next for understanding injustices. Research is important, but as we saw in that past image, an image can be really powerful. So I'd really like to explore that more through photo voice. This is an example from Jan Benning, a photographer who photographed bureaucrats around the world. And as our colleagues have mentioned, paperwork is a part of being an international student. It's just unavoidable. And I had thought about international students when I saw these images. But I'd love a chance to do some sort of photo elicitation or photo voice project where we get to see, like with my colleague had shared with all of the folder file documents, what does paperwork, bureaucratic violence, conditionality, what does that look like in photos? So I'll stop there. These are my references. And if you have questions, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shannon. I think any of us who have had visas before really resonated with the idea of bureaucracy as violence. So thank you so much for sharing that. We're now going to turn over to Katja, and I'm going to share Katja's slides. So please give me a moment because I cannot talk and function at the same time.
I can start introducing myself in the meantime. Thank you.
Yes, hopefully you can all see that now. Over to you, Katja.
Okay, thank you, Jenna. So hi, everybody. My name is Ekaterina Minaeva. I'm a doctoral candidate at Lynch School of Education at Boston College and a research assistant at CHE, Center for International Higher Education. I had a lot of experience as an international student myself. I was an Erasmus Master's student, and that implies visiting 4 countries together with my cohort. And I had other international experiences throughout my education journey. And I am an international student right now. I am from Russia. And I also did a bit of research on international student experiences during my, I guess, 7 years of scholarly pursuits. And for several years, I worked as an advisor to international students, not as an agent, but as more like a mentor, a person who orients international students in all the opportunities that they may have, and explains how to write motivation letters, how to write scholarship letters, and so on. So that was several years of supporting international students, and that was, I would say, my most favorite project so far. And today I'll be talking about university space as a knowledge culture, and I'll be talking about Lefebvrean analysis of international student spatial practices. That's something, Lefebvrean framework is something that I'm experimenting with within my PhD project, and that's only the part of the research that is related specifically to the space, and these are the intermediate results. I will talk a little bit about the scope and the next steps of my research towards the end of the presentation. Next slide, please, Jenna. Thank you. So as I was thinking about how to approach the topic of experiences of international students in the university, I, of course, went through literature that I'm not going to cite because I guess everybody is pretty much familiar with it. I was really puzzled by the contrast between the narratives, really rigid narratives about international students that we all know, essentialization, homogenization, deficit narratives, and so on, and the visions that are emerging in scholarship, for example, from work of colleagues like Simon Marginson, Rita Locatelli, Catherine Montgomery, recent work of Maya Chancellani, and so on. There are many of them. But in actuality, the discourse about internationalization and international students as meaningful part of higher education is really not new, and yet systemically we do have this constant gap between what students are experiencing and what it's supposed to mean, even though the conversation, I would say, dates back to the 90s, if not earlier. Next slide, please. And as I was looking at the larger context of higher education knowledge culture, I came to a conclusion. It's not my conclusion, it's like my personal discovery for me personally, but also a well-known fact in higher education, that there are 2 main things that are structurally very important in higher education, and that are basically the opposite of student mobility and internationalization. First, it's instrumentalization that for many reasons increased exponentially over the years because of the metrics, performativity, marketization, and other reasons, and because of the flattening of the knowledge and fragmentation. That comes from the Foucauldian idea of university as a factory. And there is a lot of research on how epistemic spaces are siloed and how from the notions of Charles Taylor and his idea of cultural fragmentation to the very recent works of the colleagues. And so this research focuses mostly on these two problems. Next slide, please. And the problem, what makes it even more urgent, is that basically fragmentation and instrumentalization contribute to the combinatorics as a knowledge production techniques, where actually it's not the meaning making that is centered, but we already take predefined concepts, we combine them, and we really don't go deeper into our knowledge, culture, and meanings, and we really don't go don't travel across the epistemic fields. And it seems that that exactly is the reason why international students, one of the reasons, but a very serious structural reason why international students are feeling the way that they're feeling, and why it's so difficult to bring alternative practices to higher education space, because it was not designed for such practices in the first place. Next slide, please. So, I started thinking about what would it mean to have a cross-epistemic orientation, and in fact, have this have cross-cultural orientation as a case of cross-epistemic orientation. And what would it mean to have this cross-epistemic culture in the university? And that means first, deep meaning making within logics, which implies reflexivity, relationality, and other important aspects. And also moving across logics and mediating contradictions across logics. And those are providing conditions for these two processes is a necessary condition of having a more holistic cross-epistemic space in higher education. And it's important that this space this orientation can be developed by the first-hand experience when the knowledge is received directly and perceived by the knower. And also the continuity of experience is really important here, because the experiences, and especially cross-epistemic experiences, are layered. There are all sorts of adaptation slash meaning making slash wandering curves, and the continuity of experience adds richness to the cross-epistemic practices. And so I started thinking about how social material conditions of universities are influencing the epistemic cultures of university, and how they are hindering or benefiting the development of cross-epistemic orientation. And next slide, please. And for that, I decided to talk to international students, because for them, international student population, they are really a bright case of it, because the siloed spaces, they sense it more than other students, because they usually don't have instruments to mitigate them so fast, and it takes longer time and to mitigate them, and usually they are more visual, and that's one of the reasons of experiences being isolated. And of course, there are a lot of agentic moves that international students can make, and yet that's a very interesting and bright case. Just like international student mobility can be a bright case of successful cross-epistemic orientation if done nicely. Next slide, please. So I started with the ideas, with the works of Ronald Barnett and other colleagues who are thinking about university culture as holistic, university as a place-making project, and university culture as simultaneously being and becoming, meaning that it's being produced and it affects all people that are operating within it, that are living in it, and it is further produced by people who are included in the university culture and the university space. And in order to operationalize this, I applied Henry Lefebvre's production of space concept, and this is a very rich framework, so I took only a few central concepts from there, and the main ideas is that he similarly takes space as something that is holistic, something that is socially produced, and that carries physical, social, and symbolic dimensions. And similarly to Barnett, he sees space as a product of human activity and something that affects humans who are in this space. Next slide, please. And one of the most famous Lefebvre's notions is this like spatial triad. It's conceived space, the space how it was intended to be, perceived space, the immediate perception of people who are interacting with the space, and the lived space. This is where students particularly make meanings, live into spaces, and negotiate meanings within the space. And there are also some interesting concepts that are helpful for understanding space, such as historicity, analysis of rhythms, and dialectical orientation, meaning specific attention to contradictions that emerge within spaces and across spaces. Next slide, please. So in order to collect my data, I used mental sketch mapping. So I asked students to draw the representations of the space, of the campus space, not in geographical accuracy, but in the ways how they perceive it and how it looks in their minds. And I so far interviewed 12 international PhD students. And the requirements that I had for participants is that they are supposed to be enrolled at PhD program for at least 2 years, so that they have somewhat prolonged experience, and they completed bachelor's degree in their home country, so that they are familiar with both education systems of their home country and the host country. Next slide, please. Those are the examples of the maps. And as you see, they take students use very different styles and very different techniques to portray what their experiences in the spaces are and what spaces are most significant to them. Next slide, please. I will not stop at coding a procedure because for the interest of time, but I will just say that at the step 1, I coded specific spaces. So I talked with students about what spaces are most important to them and what spaces, what routes are most important to them, how much time they spend in certain spaces, which spaces they avoid, and so on. And that was the analysis. I also analyzed textures and the embodied feelings of international students in these meaningful spaces. And at the next step, next slide, please. I tried to go one level above and reflect more on what it means for the campus space altogether. Is it the smaller part of the campus that students tend to draw on their maps? Is it fragmented? Are there some routes that students never take? Are there some spaces that are completely avoided and never mentioned? And so on. And I tried also to analyze the relational nature of these spaces within the larger campus space and also temporal patterns across campus. Next slide, please. So in terms of findings, there are several things that I would like to highlight. I know I only have a few minutes left. So it's interesting that most mentioned spaces, there were not really many of them, because usually it's individual workplaces, most often mentioned space PI office, and those are 2 main assigned spaces for students. There are also communal spaces such as Education Resource Center and departmental office, and leisure spaces, which also there are only, the cafeteria is mentioned most often, and there are a couple of other places that are mentioned as well, but the diversity of places is actually not so high, and students mention and the analysis of what they're saying shows that the spaces are conceived really to be very practical and oriented toward productivity and speed, and at least most of them. And students perceive, I will further stop at on some citations, but students mostly perceive space as very enclosed. So this is the space that where I'm allowed to work. This is the space where I'm allowed to be. This is the space where I don't feel welcome. And also the perceived time is very compressed. So students feel a lot of time pressure in terms of things need to be done fast. This should be done within only these deadlines, and the workload amount is really high. And as I was looking at the lived spaces. So this is how students make meaning of these spaces and where they apply their agency, hopefully. Uh, and students build relationship with their individual workplaces, and they can see that really reflects in their special relationship. For example, one student says, "I feel like there is a huge familiarity now since I've been working there for years now. I feel that because my place is really cluttered. This is a signal that I'm really comfortable with the place." So allowing certain messiness, meshwork, as some scholars would say, is a sign of growing into space and making negotiations with it. However, there are also other more negative experiences where students do not have enough space to build a relationship and reassign meanings. For example, in his meaning, private PI, in his advisor's office, it's like you will be standing. He's also standing, and sometimes, they're like hours long, and you'll be standing and discussing this data. And sometimes I feel that depending on his mood, he would it's not a pleasant experience. Sometimes you asked about these theoretical questions, and if you're not prepared, he gets upset with you. It's a space I dread. It's not really a pleasant experience for me. So some of these assigned spaces are where students do not have really agency to negotiate. And going the level above, I will skip that just to stop at the most important things. So usually the space is limited only to 2-3 places, and students really don't go to wander around on campus and to explore some unknown or unfamiliar spaces that are not assigned to them. Connections across spaces are also only rarely explicit, and sometimes they are lacking. And also in terms of temporal patterns across campus, there is a lack of durable communal spaces. So for example, even if there is a certain communal event, let's say, it's only one event, and it doesn't really do much for students who spend 95% of their time being engaged in a completely different isolated work. So Jenna, do I have a minute to pull in a couple of citations, or not really? Okay, so one citation that I want to bring forward here is about, next slide, please. And next slide, please. Yeah. No, please go back. Yeah. You want to have some cross-departmental or some cross-school events to know more of other PhD students from other departments. And I think there are already events there. The thing is that we don't really go there. I think it has to do with priority. Would I rather go to that place and meet new people, or would I read this paper or start this experiment? It's always prioritizing. I think at this point, we'd rather finish our experiments and get the data without trying to build new friends or try to socialize. And the next slide, please. So here, a student describes how on her second year she took a tour with another person on campus. And the person was walking and introducing her to different departments within the university. And I will just read a part of it. He walked me to these places, and slowly during the course of that experience, I began to feel less nervous. On the walk, I was like, I don't feel like this is my campus. These are the parts of the campus that I feel awkward entering, and it makes no sense. Why should I feel this way? The feeling. Why should I not feel at home? Why should I feel awkward entering the language building? And so I realized that to do with the fragmentation of the disciplines, that's terrible. I have no friends in any other departments. I'm afraid to enter that space. And I think they see me as an intruder. Next slide, please. In terms of other findings, there was a notable difference between STEM students and students from humanities. For STEM students, the space is much more silent, which is consistent with recent findings from, for example, Vera Spangler recent work. Also, the data shows the visible contradictions between factory practices and the university messages. So the message of the university about cross-culturality, transdisciplinarity, and similar orientations is explicit. However, the daily practice doesn't confirm that, and in fact is reinforcing the opposite orientations. And also, I will skip that. Yeah. Just a couple of words in the conclusion. This is the intermediate results from interviewing students from one particular university. And for my research, I also want to do 2 other institutions to see whether it differs more by university or by specialization, and to further come back to these participants and ask them questions about what kind of support they would like to see. And that hopefully will form a solid set of recommendations. But also the main conclusion that I'm seeing from this research is that really the daily practices that really form the culture of knowledge, they do not reinforce cross-epistemic orientations in any tangible ways, unfortunately, which reflects to how international students feel and the ability of them to bring forward their perspective, their domestic perspectives, and also make meaning across epistemic logics in the host university. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Katja. That's a hugely interesting example of an interdisciplinary project. I'm going to move us to our final speaker, who is asked not to be recorded, so I am going to stop the recording here. Thank you if you're following up after the session. And now